But I remember hearing it consistently in Bible college myself and throughout my church experience. Like you said, that the time between the Old and New Testament was one of grave silence. I mean, it's in children's books, up in
Yeah,
my kids' rooms, it's everywhere. I was told
yeah,
God just stopped communicating, and one of the key themes that I took away from your work was how both the scriptures of Israel and the history of Israel speak to the suppression of prophets and prophecy to
yeah.
avoid criticism of falsely established rulers. Did I get that right? Is that
That's a really good nutshell summary. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and it was so important. And George, with that summary, what I want you to do is help us understand where this myth of prophetic silence came from inside the history of Israel. Why did that develop? Why was prophecy dangerous to the powers at hand? And where did this myth come from?
Yeah, the idea in its fully formed expression comes from probably at the earliest the second century AD. That's a couple of centuries after Jesus. What that means is the early church, the first generation, the second generation of the church, the generation of the apostles, they never thought that there had been a silence for a number of centuries before the culmination of God's promises in Jesus. And so naturally, that raises the question, well, where did the idea come from? The seeds of the idea go back to the second century BC. And this is the time when the Maccabees, who are a priestly family, they instigate a revolt against what they perceive as liberal Jews in their own nation and their Greek Seleucid overlords who ruled Judea from Antioch in Syria. And they rebelled against the Seleucid authorities. And eventually, down the track, it took them a few decades, they gained power and independence for the Jewish nation. And they were the ones who were at the head of it.
Hmm.
And because they were priests, they saw their legitimacy as coming from the Torah, that is, from the law, the first five books of the scriptures. And they didn't need any prophetic books to legitimize their own power. In fact, if they accepted the prophetic books, then they would have to in some way make room for a Davidic descendant to come along at some point and sit on the throne to rule God's covenant nation, the nation of Israel. And they were not, keen for that kind of thing. They didn't come to power and want to give it up at some point. And so it was a gradual thing. It wasn't, an immediate thing that happened overnight, but gradually they started to suppress this idea that God somehow had something further in store for the Jewish nation,
Hmm.
and that something else was the raising of an heir of David, someone in the line of Davidic descent who would come along and take royal power and rule the nation on God's behalf
Hmm.
in fulfillment of both the Davidic covenant, which we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and the prophetic promises. So many of the prophets said that even though the kingdom of David fell to the Babylonians in the early 6th century BC, God's promise to David was permanent. It was eternal and it wasn't changing. God was not going back on his word. He fully intended to, once again, raise a Davidic descendant to rule his people as his son. This is the nature of the Davidic covenant, that the Davidic heir would rule the nation as a son of God, an adopted son in terms of the Old Testament time period, but as a son nonetheless. And so the Maccabees, who eventually we start calling them the Hasmoneans, they form a dynasty of, first of all, priests, and then they declare themselves kings. And so there is a direct contrast between their royal claim and the Davidic promises, which are also royal in nature. And you've got a large portion of Judaism who say, well, okay, we're glad that we've got independence. We're glad that the Maccabees or Hasmoneans have given us independence. We can stand on our own 2 feet now as a nation on the international stage. But the Maccabees are not God's ultimate purpose for Israel. God's ultimate purpose for Israel is to rule us through his son, who is a Davidic heir. And so the Maccabees, eventually they started to suppress this kind of idea. And they started to say things like, well, God's not going to send any more prophets. He might have sent prophets in the past. They didn't deny that. But God was not interested in sending any more prophets. In fact, God's purpose, they argued, for the Jewish nation was to be a kingdom of priests. And that's an idea that we get straight out of Exodus, that all of Israel is a kingdom of priests. And eventually one of the Hasmoneans, Maccabees, Hasmoneans, remember those terms are kind of interchangeable. One of the Hasmoneans, Aristobulus, in 104 BC declares himself king. And so Israel, or Judea as it was known at the time, effectively became the kingdom of a priest. He was the high priest of the nation at the time. And so whenever there was someone who came forward with a claim that no, God was wanting something other than the current power structures, they were his good and righteous purposes, and not to go along with that was a subversion of God's purposes. The Hasmoneans were not going to stand idly by and let people just say that. And so we have evidence of them starting to suppress prophecy, suppress prophetic groups or prophetic figures, and so that they could stay in power. Eventually, they kind of lose power once the Romans come on the scene in 63 BC. The Romans take over and they kind of reorganize things. And then eventually we get to the rise of Herod the Great, who's not a Hasmonean, even though he tries to marry into the family. He does actually marry into the family. But it's interesting how Herod tries to get Davidic theology on side for his own purposes. But there are still people in Judaism saying, no, God's purposes lie with a Messiah, a future Messiah, an anointed one from the line of David. But those who are in power, and for the most part, that's either the Herodian family by the 1st century and the priests come to wield enormous power and influence, and they are fabulously wealthy. They're not going to stand by for a Messiah. They're not going to just, vacate the stage for a Messiah. And so they continue to suppress prophetic figures. And this is exactly what we see in the New Testament. The Herodians, Herod Antipas, he kills John the Baptist. And Jesus himself falls foul of the priests. They're the ones who organize his arrest. They try him and they make fun of him as a prophet. They punch him in the face while he's blindfolded and say, prophesy, who hit you? Yeah. They make a mockery of this idea that, there could possibly be a prophet. And ultimately they hand him on to Pontius Pilate, who has him crucified. And then we've got the early church, the figures of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. In Acts, he stands up before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling body, and he says to them, which of the prophets did you and your ancestors not persecute? Now, he doesn't say, look, I know we've not had any prophets for the last few centuries. He never says that at all. And Jesus, in fact, never says that at all either. Jesus actually thinks that there's been a crescendo of prophets leading up to his day. And he says that crescendo reaches a peak with John the Baptist, the greatest of the prophets. So Jesus doesn't think that, there had been a prophetic silence for 3, 4, 5 centuries.
Pause real quick, because what I want to do is make sure that I'm following you, and so is my audience. So what you're saying is that this Game of Thrones that was taking place between the priests, these Hasmoneans, after the Maccabean revolt, the suppression of prophecy, the suppression of prophets, and the declaration of this period being silent that we now have in my children's book up in my upstairs comes from that moment, stems back from all the way back there in the history. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's where it originates.
Yeah.
But the idea doesn't get fully formed until a few centuries later. In the 2nd century BC, we have the Jewish rabbis who became the leaders of Judaism after the fall of the temple, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The rabbis are largely the heirs of the Pharisees. And in the 2nd century AD, the Jewish nation was quite divided. You had those who believed in Jesus, those who were part of the early church, remembering that for the first couple of centuries, the early church was quite Jewish. In fact, most believers probably were Jewish at that time. And then you've got those who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that, you know, he was a criminal, he wasn't the fulfillment of God's promises and was rightly crucified, and deny the resurrection, etc. Those parts of Judaism have to deal with a lot of their own compatriots saying that Jesus is the Messiah and the fulfillment of the ages has happened with the coming of Jesus. And so in the 2nd century AD, we hear them say in their writings that the Holy Spirit fell silent after in roughly the 5th or 4th century BC, and thereafter was practically inaudible. God effectively stopped sending prophets, stopped inspiring prophetic figures, stopped inspiring scripture to be written. And this was partly in response to the Christian claims. The idea is that Jesus could not have been the Messiah. He could not have even been a prophet because God stopped speaking centuries beforehand. And they're building on the momentum that had started with the Hasmonean claim a few centuries earlier in the 2nd century BC.
That's so interesting because it's like I said earlier, you know, it is a Game of Thrones. And, you know, the Davidic dynasty, it's how we get from this succession of kings in power to a successions of priests in power. When we come to Jesus's day, it's like, where did that go? And they don't want these to come. They don't want that to come back out because it's going to take away their power and their rule. And then the reclamation of that realized in the person of Jesus makes it so much more powerful. And I love that. And I'm glad that it was drawn out in your book. And we're going to get into a lot of that more. So I think that was cool because that was like a good brief synopsis of overarching themes that are coming through the book that we're going to dive into on our timeline.